You're standing in the kitchen and you've just opened the refrigerator. You're holding the door handle and the cool air is hitting your face, and you realize you have no idea why you're there. Not just a vague sense of forgetting, complete blankness. And the interesting part is that you remember walking from the living room. You remember setting your book down. You remember standing up. But the reason you came to the kitchen is just gone. And then maybe 10 seconds later it comes back. Or maybe you walk back to the living room and sit down, and then it returns, like it was waiting for you to retrace your steps. That specific pattern, the action is intact, the movement is fine, but the intention behind it has slipped away for a moment, is one of the first things people mention when they start worrying about memory after 60. Not dramatic forgetting, not losing entire days. Just this odd gap where the thread of purpose disappears and then reappears, and it bothers people. It bothers them more than forgetting a name, because it feels internal. It feels like the machinery itself is glitching. Now here's what most people assume when that happens. They assume memory is one thing, one system, one file cabinet that's either working or starting to fail. And they assume that if they're noticing these little gaps, it means the whole system is starting to degrade in a linear way, like rust spreading across metal, and that assumption leads to a very specific kind of fear. The fear that this is the beginning of a predictable decline, that these small moments are previews of something much larger. And I understand that fear. It makes sense. But it's based on a misunderstanding of what memory actually is and how it changes after 60. And that misunderstanding causes people to interpret normal patterns as warning signs, and it causes them to miss the actual signals that matter. So let me walk through what's really happening. And I'm going to take some time with this because the misconception runs deep and it affects how people live. It affects whether they trust themselves. It affects whether they speak up when something genuinely changes, and I think it's worth dismantling carefully. The first thing to understand is that memory isn't a single system. It's not one cabinet. It's more like a network of systems that do different jobs, and those systems age at different rates. When you walk into the kitchen and forget why you're there, you're not experiencing a failure of memory as a whole. You're experiencing a very specific kind of lapse that involves what we call prospective memory. That's the system that holds on to intentions. The plan to do something in the near future. I'm going to get a glass of water. I'm going to check the mail. I'm going to call my daughter after lunch. Prospective memory is fragile by design. It's not built for long-term storage. It's built to hold a goal just long enough to execute it, and it relies heavily on context. On environmental cues, on the continuity of your attention. When you stand up and walk into another room, you're crossing a threshold. Literally. And thresholds disrupt that fragile thread of intention. It's not that the memory is gone, it's that the cue that was holding it in place has been left behind. And this happens to everyone. It happens at 30, it happens at 50, it happens at 70. But after 60, people notice it more. Not necessarily because it's happening more often, though it may be, but because they're watching for it. They're primed to interpret it as a sign. And once you start watching for something, you see it everywhere. That's not paranoia. That's just how attention works. You become sensitized, and the more you notice it, the more you worry. And the more you worry, the more you monitor yourself. And that monitoring actually makes the problem worse, because now you're splitting your attention. You're not just walking to the kitchen to get water. You're walking to the kitchen while also watching yourself to see if you'll forget why you're there. And that divided attention increases the chance that you will. So the misconception is this. People think that forgetting why they walked into a room is an early memory problem, a sign that something is starting to fail. But what it actually is, most of the time, is a completely ordinary glitch in prospective memory that's being amplified by self-monitoring and interpreted through the lens of fear. It's not that nothing is changing. Things do change after 60. But this specific pattern is not the red flag people think it is. Now let me explain what actually does change, and this is where it helps to think about memory not as one thing, but as a collection of processes that rely on different parts of the brain and different kinds of resources. Some of those processes stay remarkably stable, some of them improve, and some of them become less efficient. After 60, the processes that tend to slow down are the ones that require a lot of mental energy and a lot of active maintenance. Working memory, for example. That's the system that holds information in mind while you manipulate it. Doing math in your head. Following a complex set of directions. Holding 3 different pieces of information and comparing them. That system relies on the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is one of the areas that shows age-related changes relatively early. Not damage, not disease, just a gradual shift in how efficiently it operates. But here's the part that gets missed. While working memory becomes less efficient, other types of memory often stay strong or even improve. Semantic memory, which is your knowledge base, your vocabulary, your understanding of how things work. That tends to be stable or even richer after 60 because you've spent decades accumulating it. Emotional memory, the ability to remember the gist of an experience and how it made you feel, often stays intact. Procedural memory, the memory for how to do things, how to ride a bike, or make a recipe you've made 100 times, that's remarkably durable. So what people are experiencing after 60 is not a global decline, it's a shift in the profile. Some systems slow down, others stay strong. And the overall picture is much more nuanced than the simple story of decline that most people carry in their heads. And this is where the metaphor helps. Think about a garden hose. If the water pressure is low, you might assume the pump is failing. But often the problem isn't the pump. It's a kink in the hose. Something is blocking the flow. And if you go straight to trying to fix the pump, you're going to waste a lot of time and energy. You need to check the hose first, release the kink, see if that restores the flow. And in the brain, after 60, a lot of what looks like memory failure is actually a kink, not a pump problem. The kink might be sleep. It might be medication side effects. It might be low-grade depression or anxiety. It might be understimulation. It might be hearing loss that's making it harder to encode information in the first place. These things don't damage memory. They interfere with it. They create friction. And when you release that friction, memory often improves. Not back to 20, but significantly better than it was when the kink was in place. So the misconception that I see over and over is that people notice a memory lapse, they assume it's the pump, and they resign themselves to it. They stop trying to identify the kinks. And that resignation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you believe your memory is failing and there's nothing you can do about it, you stop engaging in the behaviors that support memory. You stop challenging yourself, you stop learning new things, you withdraw socially, and all of those things make memory worse. Not because of age, but because of disuse. Let me give you an example. I had a patient in his late 60s who came in convinced he was developing dementia. He'd been forgetting names, forgetting why he walked into rooms, losing track of conversations, and he was terrified. His father had had Alzheimer's, and he was sure this was the beginning of the same path. We talked for a while. I asked about his sleep. Terrible. He'd been waking up 3 or 4 times a night for months. I asked about his mood. He admitted he'd been feeling pretty low since he retired. He missed the structure. He missed the sense of purpose. I asked about his hearing. He said it was fine, but when I tested it, he had significant high-frequency hearing loss. He hadn't noticed because it had been gradual, but it meant that in conversations, especially in noisy environments, he was missing pieces of what people said. And then later, when he tried to remember the conversation, the memory was incomplete. Not because his memory was broken, but because the information had never been fully encoded in the first place. We addressed the sleep. We talked about hearing aids. We talked about finding new sources of structure and engagement. And within a few months, his memory improved. Not perfectly. He still forgot why he walked into rooms sometimes, but the constant sense of slipping, the feeling that he couldn't trust his own mind, that went away. And what he realized was that most of what he'd been interpreting as memory failure was actually a collection of small, fixable problems that were piling up and creating a cumulative effect. That's the pattern I see most often, not dementia, not Alzheimer's. Just a pile of kinks that nobody thought to look for because everyone assumed the problem was age itself. Now I want to talk about what people do in response to these memory lapses, because this is where the misconception causes the most harm. When people notice they're forgetting things, they often try to compensate by working harder, by forcing themselves to remember, by repeating things over and over in their head, by testing themselves. And that approach feels logical. It feels like you're fighting back. But it often backfires. Because memory doesn't respond well to force. It responds to context, to meaning, to connection, to rest. When you try to force it, you create stress. And stress floods the system with cortisol, and cortisol interferes with the exact processes you're trying to support. So you end up in this loop where you're working harder and harder and getting worse and worse results, and that convinces you even more that something is seriously wrong. Here's a better approach. And this isn't a list of tips. This is a shift in how you think about what you're doing. Instead of trying to force your memory to work the way it did at 30, you work with the system you have now. You build in external support. You use calendars. You use notes. You use alarms. Not because you're giving up, but because you're being smart. You're recognizing that prospective memory is fragile, and you're not going to fix that by willpower. You're going to support it with structure, and that's not a failure. That's adaptation. I use alarms. I use notes, not because my memory's broken, but because I know how memory works, and I know that relying on it for everything is inefficient. And here's the other part. You reduce the kinks. You prioritize sleep, not just more sleep, but better sleep, consistent sleep. You address hearing loss if it's there. You review your medications with your doctor to see if any of them might be affecting cognition. A lot of common medications have anticholinergic effects, and those effects accumulate. They interfere with memory and attention. Antihistamines, certain blood pressure medications, medications for overactive bladder. Sleep aids. People take these things for years without realizing they're creating cognitive friction. And when you stop them or switch to alternatives, memory often improves. You also stay engaged, not in a forced way, not by doing crossword puzzles because you think you're supposed to, but by staying connected to things that matter to you. Conversations, projects, learning, curiosity. The brain is plastic. It adapts. And when you give it rich, meaningful input, it builds new connections. Not as fast as it did at 20, but it still builds them. And those connections support memory. So the practical action here is not a list of memory exercises. It's a shift in approach. Stop interpreting every lapse as a sign of decline. Start looking for kinks, sleep, medications, hearing, mood, understimulation, and address those first. See what happens. You might be surprised. Now let me talk about when you should actually be concerned. Because I don't want to give the impression that all memory changes are benign. Some aren't, and it's important to know the difference. The pattern that matters, the pattern that should prompt a conversation with a doctor, is not forgetting why you walked into a room. It's not forgetting a name. It's not losing your keys. Those things happen to everyone. The pattern that matters is a change in your ability to do things you've always done, a change in your independence. If you've always managed your finances and suddenly you're making mistakes you wouldn't have made before, that's worth mentioning. If you've always been able to follow a recipe and now you're getting lost in the steps, that's worth mentioning. If you're getting lost in places you know well, that's worth mentioning. If people around you are noticing changes that you're not noticing, that's worth mentioning. The key is not the presence of forgetting. It's the presence of functional change. A shift in your ability to navigate your life. And even then, the first step is not to assume the worst. The first step is to rule out the kinks. Because even significant memory problems can be caused by things that are treatable. Depression, thyroid problems, vitamin deficiencies, sleep apnea, medication effects. Those things can mimic dementia. And if you catch them, if you treat them, memory can improve. So the rule is this: if you notice a change that's affecting your daily life, or if someone you trust notices a change, talk to your doctor. Not because it's definitely something serious, but because it's worth figuring out what's going on. And the earlier you have that conversation, the more options you have. But if what you're noticing is occasional lapses in prospective memory, if you're forgetting why you walked into rooms or losing your train of thought in conversations, and it's not getting worse, and it's not affecting your independence, then what you're experiencing is most likely normal age-related change. Not disease, not decline, just change. And the best response is not fear. It's adaptation. I also want to touch on something that doesn't get talked about enough, which is the role of expectation. After 60, people expect to have memory problems. They've been told their whole lives that aging means forgetting, and that expectation shapes how they interpret their experience. If you expect to forget, you notice every time you do, and you don't notice the 1,000 times you remember. You don't give yourself credit for navigating a complex day, managing multiple responsibilities, remembering appointments, remembering conversations, remembering what your grandchildren told you last week. You only notice the gaps. And that creates a distorted picture. It makes normal variability look like decline. There's research on this. When older adults are reminded of negative stereotypes about aging and memory before they take a memory test, they perform worse. Not because their memory is worse, but because the stereotype creates stress and self-doubt, and that interferes with performance. And when they're given positive messages about aging, or when the stereotype isn't activated, they perform better. So the story you tell yourself about your memory actually affects your memory. And if the story you're telling yourself is that you're failing, that story becomes part of the problem. This is why I spend so much time on the misconception, because the misconception isn't just wrong, it's harmful. It creates fear, it creates withdrawal, it creates a self-fulfilling spiral. And breaking that spiral starts with understanding what's actually happening. Understanding that memory is not one thing. Understanding that forgetting why you walked into a room is not the beginning of dementia. Understanding that most of what changes after 60 is not disease, it's a shift in profile. Some things slow down, other things stay strong. And with the right support, with the right approach, you can live a full, engaged, cognitively rich life well into your 80s and beyond. Let me come back to the garden hose metaphor for a moment, because I think it's worth sitting with. When water pressure drops, the instinct is to panic, to assume the worst, to think the whole system is failing. But most of the time, the system is fine. There's just a kink, and the kink is often something simple, something fixable. And if you take the time to check for kinks before you assume the pump is broken, you save yourself a lot of unnecessary worry. You also save yourself from giving up too soon. Because if you believe the pump is broken, you stop trying, you stop maintaining the system, you stop using it, and that's when real problems start. So the practical takeaway is this. When you notice a memory lapse, don't jump to the worst conclusion. Pause. Ask yourself if there's a kink. Are you sleeping well? Are you hearing clearly? Are you on any new medications? Are you feeling low or anxious? Are you understimulated? Are you socially isolated? Those are the first questions. And if the answer to any of them is yes, that's where you start. Not with memory exercises, not with supplements, not with resignation, with addressing the kink. And if you address the kinks and the problem persists, or if the problem is affecting your daily life, then you have a conversation with your doctor. But you have that conversation from a place of clarity, not panic. You go in with information. You describe the specific changes you've noticed. You describe when they started. You describe how they're affecting you. and you ask for a proper evaluation, not just a quick screening. A real evaluation that looks at cognitive function, that looks at mood, that looks at sleep, that looks at medications, that looks at all the things that can create cognitive friction, because the goal is not to get a diagnosis. The goal is to get clarity, to understand what's happening, to rule out the things that can be fixed, and to make informed decisions based on real information, not fear. Now I want to address something that comes up a lot in these conversations, which is the question of prevention. People ask, is there anything I can do to prevent memory decline? And the answer is complicated. You can't prevent aging. You can't stop the clock. But you can absolutely influence how your brain ages. And the things that influence it are not exotic. They're not expensive. They're not complicated. They're the basics: sleep, movement, social connection, mental engagement, cardiovascular health. Those things matter. They matter a lot. And the reason they matter is not because they stop your brain from aging. They don't, but they support the systems that keep your brain functioning well. They reduce inflammation, they improve blood flow, they promote neuroplasticity, they give your brain the resources it needs to adapt. And here's the key: you don't have to do everything perfectly. You don't have to run marathons or become a chess master or meditate for an hour a day. You just have to stay engaged. You have to move your body regularly. You have to sleep reasonably well. You have to stay connected to people. You have to keep learning, even if it's just learning something small. A new recipe, a new route, a new piece of music. The brain responds to novelty. It responds to challenge, and when you give it those things, it stays more flexible. It builds reserve, and that reserve is what protects you when things start to change. So prevention isn't about stopping change. It's about building resilience. It's about creating a buffer, and the earlier you start, the better. But it's never too late. Even at 70, even at 80, the brain can still adapt. It can still build new connections. It just needs the right input. I also want to say something about the emotional side of this, because memory is not just a cognitive issue. It's an identity issue. Your memory is how you know who you are. It's how you stay connected to your past. It's how you navigate your present. And when you start to feel like your memory is slipping, it shakes your sense of self. It makes you question whether you can trust yourself, whether you're still competent, whether you're still you. And that's terrifying. I understand that. And I think it's important to acknowledge it. Because if we only talk about memory as a mechanical problem, we miss the human side. We miss the fear. We miss the grief. We miss the sense of loss that people feel when they start to notice changes. And I think part of the work here is to separate the normal changes from the catastrophic narrative, to recognize that you can have some memory lapses and still be fully yourself. You can forget why you walked into a room and still be competent, still be capable, still be whole. The lapses don't define you. They don't erase you. They're just part of the landscape of aging. And aging is not a disease. It's a stage of life, and it comes with changes. Some of them are hard, some of them are frustrating. But they don't mean you're disappearing. Let me come back to the patient I mentioned earlier, the man in his late 60s who thought he was developing dementia. After we addressed the sleep and the hearing and the mood, after his memory improved, he said something that stuck with me. He said, "I feel like I got myself back." And that phrase captures it, because what he'd lost wasn't his memory. It was his confidence, his trust in himself, his sense that he could rely on his own mind. And when the kinks were released, when the friction was reduced, he didn't just remember better, he felt like himself again. And that's what I want for people, not perfect memory, not the memory of a 30-year-old, but the sense that they can trust themselves, that they can adapt, that they're still here. So if you're someone who's been worrying about memory, if you've been noticing lapses and interpreting them as signs of something terrible, I want you to take a breath. I want you to step back from the catastrophic narrative. I want you to ask yourself if there are kinks, and I want you to address those first. And if the problem persists, if it's affecting your life, then you have a conversation with your doctor. But you don't start with fear. You start with curiosity. You start with the assumption that most problems have explanations, and most explanations point to things that can be addressed. And if you're someone who's watching a loved one and you're worried about them, the same principles apply. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't catastrophize. But also, don't ignore real changes. If you're noticing things they're not noticing, if they're struggling with things they used to do easily, if they're getting lost or confused in ways that are new, then it's worth having a gentle conversation. Not an accusation, not a confrontation, just a conversation. I've noticed this. Have you noticed it? Do you think it's worth talking to your doctor? And then you support them in having that conversation. You go with them if they want you to. You help them articulate what's happening. Because sometimes the hardest part is just naming it, just saying it out loud. I think one of the most important things I can say here is that uncertainty is okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't have to know whether what you're experiencing is normal or not. You can sit with the uncertainty. You can observe, you can gather information, you can make adjustments, and if things change, if new patterns emerge, then you respond. But you don't have to live in constant fear. You don't have to interpret every lapse as a harbinger. You can give yourself permission to not know, to wait and see, to trust that if something serious is happening, it will become clear over time, and you can address it then. And in the meantime, you live. You stay engaged. You stay curious. You stay connected, because that's what supports your brain, that's what builds resilience, and that's what makes life worth living, regardless of whether your memory is perfect. So to bring this together, the misconception is that memory is one thing, and that forgetting why you walked into a room is the first sign of serious decline. The reality is that memory is a collection of systems, some of which change after 60 and some of which don't. And the pattern that most people worry about, the prospective memory lapse, the momentary loss of intention, is usually not a sign of disease. It's a normal feature of how prospective memory works, amplified by self-monitoring and interpreted through fear. The better approach is to stop catastrophizing, to look for kinks, to address sleep, hearing, medications, mood, engagement, to build external support, to adapt, and to seek medical evaluation only when there's a real change in function, a real impact on daily life. That's the framework. That's the model that works. And if you take one thing from this, I hope it's this. Memory lapses after 60 are not the end of the story. They're not proof that you're failing. They're just information. And what you do with that information matters more than the lapses themselves. If this helped clarify things, if it gave you a different way to think about what you've been noticing, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video and subscribe to Everyday Health Podcast for more conversations like this one. And turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. And if there's a specific memory concern you've been wondering about, something that didn't get covered here, leave a comment and let me know. I read them, and they help shape what I talk about next.